to WIDA board member Tim Keeler. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today on the stage. After discussion amongst the panels, we'll try to open up for some questions from the room.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks everyone for coming. I want to thank our distinguished guests for coming with the excellent speech, and hope to have a good panel session here with Q&A, both from me and from our active crowd. WIDA members do like to ask questions, so we appreciate very much your willingness to take them. Let me quickly introduce our other panelists. Right Honorable Owen Paterson is a member of Parliament, and he's also a former Secretary of State for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs. And Mr. Shanker Singham leads the International Trade and Competition Unit at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and is Chairman and CEO of Commentary Group. Did I pronounce that correctly? Good. So our timing was excellent in WIDA scheduling. Given all the headlines that are coming out of London, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, will the Prime Minister still be Prime Minister in a month or two?
Can you hear me? There you go. All right. Can you hear me? Oh, yes. We only undertake to answer some questions, not all of them. I was woken up in the middle of the night last night by the BBC Radio 4 programme to ask me exactly that same question. And my response to them was that I invented a completely new convention, which your politicians always follow. So when they go abroad, they never criticise the president. And so that's now the British convention from here on. What will happen? Look, as of an hour ago, there were not 48 letters in. The precipitation of a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister is 48 letters being put in to start that process. As of an hour ago, they weren't in. What is certainly the case, however, is the Prime Minister and the government are under enormous pressure. Yesterday, in the House of Commons, I think it was she was presenting the case for this deal, and for the first hour of responses, nobody was supportive. Nobody in the entire, because we have people stand up and make statements and ask questions. Nobody was supportive. So the deal's under pressure, of course, with it, the Prime Minister under pressure. But beyond that, I can't really answer your question.
Do you want to say?
Good morning. Apologies for being late. I underestimated how successful your economy is and how much traffic there was. There is, for David bring right up, there is one more letter in. Chris Green's put a letter in. But I think David touched on 48 letters triggers a vote of no confidence amongst Conservative MPs, and the threshold then is 159. So there is more to play for. And I don't comment on our Prime Minister when abroad, according to David's splendid new convention, which is an instant tradition.
We specialise in instant tradition in Britain.
Excellent. So, I guess I'll take from the moderator just a couple quick questions before we turn it over to the crowd. Your speech really is a big proponent of a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, kind of imploring the U.S. administration to seize it. I think if you ask the Trump administration, they've had a view that they've been very open to it and publicly supportive of it for a long time. And in fact, I think as everybody here probably knows, taken the formal steps to notify the Congress and eventually negotiate the TPA. But as a former member of the government, when we were in government, I think some might wonder, in your negotiations with the EU, why wasn't the possibility of a US-UK free trade agreement used as more of a public bargaining chip? Perhaps it was, and it just wasn't clear from this side of the ocean. But I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. It's a very good point. One of the reasons I made that point explicitly today was to some extent to rebalance what had, it seems to me, been the impression the British government had given that this wasn't important. Now, one of the reasons for that, there is a legal reason for that. there's a thing in the European Treaty called the duty of sincere cooperation. And it applies to us for as long as we're a member, even during negotiation. And the original legal advice was given on this to the effect that we can't start a negotiation until we are actually out of the Union. One of the arguments that we had about the implementation period, that little extension period, as it were, after we leave for 21 months, after we nominally leave for 21 months, keeping everything the same. One of the big arguments of that was me insisting that we had to be able to negotiate during that time. Now, that's what the government legal advice on this was. I have to say, I am not entirely persuaded that that government legal advice was necessarily as accurate as it ought to be. You know? But what the judgment made was we didn't want to get ourselves into a court case of us not obeying the duty of sincere cooperation. Truth be told, we're so close to the end now of this negotiation, it doesn't matter. Anybody bringing a court case would be sort of talking to an empty court at the end of it. So that's why I raised it today. That's why I pushed it today. I think it would actually massively reinforce our negotiating position. Let me say why. I'm going to be quite blunt about the European Union's own objectives in this. The Union has one primary objective, and that is not to allow Britain's departure, the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union, to be so successful that it acts as an incentive for anybody else to leave. Now, I think it's a false fear. There's nobody else in Europe like us, nobody else that speaks the English language on the same basis, and not the same size, obviously Ireland does. There's nobody with our networks and our trade traditions and so on. There's nobody in a geographical position, and so on. However, that's their fear. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, some of the major European economies are very afraid of the ability of Britain to get a major competitive advantage by controlling its own regulations, by controlling its own tax policy, and so on, that we could undermine, undercut, or defeat those nations. The two most obvious ones, France is the preeminent one with that viewpoint, but also to some extent Germany takes the same view. So their aim is to constrain what we can do in economic terms. And my view is that every angle we can bring, any alternative approach we can bring, any alternative partner we can bring to the party to demonstrate to them that that won't work is beneficial and will be beneficial to the negotiation. Shanker, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think sometimes we look at Brexit, I think through the wrong end of the telescope, particularly here, outside of the UK. What you have what you should have is a major global event. You've got a G7 nation, G5, second biggest exporter of services, one of the biggest sites of foreign investment. Despite the massive political uncertainty of the year, we are still, in terms of foreign investment this year, number 2 behind China in the world. So this is a very big global event. When an economy like that adopts independent trade policy for the first time in 40 years, that is a very major event. And from a US perspective or a multinational company perspective, or in fact any company perspective, what you should ask yourself is, how do I use that opportunity? What do I want the world to look like? If I'm a pharma company, what do I want the regulatory system of the world to look like? If I'm a whatever you are, how can you use the UK-EU agreement, the UK's new independent trade and regulatory policy to achieve what you need to achieve as a country, as a company, as a consumer, all of the above. I think, to your question, based on that starting point, the problem is the UK has bifurcated the approach to the EU, our arrangements with the EU, from that independent trade and regulatory policy. If there are any benefits economically in Brexit, I'm not talking about political benefits and other issues, and democracy and so on, but if the economic benefits are only in the independent trade and regulatory policy that the UK can actually credibly execute, if you take those off the table, which is what I think this withdrawal agreement does, if you take those off the table completely, then you've taken all the benefits off the table and you are left in a damage limitation exercise. which is inevitably going to have a bad result. And that's why I think this current agreement is essentially the worst of all possible worlds. It's much, much worse than even the current UK position within the EU, at least having some ability, or an increasingly attenuated ability, to act as a brake on the direction of travel of regulation in the EU, which is moving in an increasingly prescriptive and anti-competitive direction. So I think the first problem is that bifurcation. But what we, I think, need at this point is, if this is voted down in Parliament, as David suggested in his speech, that is not necessarily a vote for no deal. It's not necessarily a vote for chaos. It is a vote that will be interpreted by both sides as a reason. We're not going to sit on our hands for the next 3 months. It will be a reason to reset the negotiations along a less legalistic and a more politically pragmatic basis. What is interesting, and all three of us have spent significant time, David more than anyone else, but Owen and I also, with Michel Barnier. And the EU's offer, their opening bid to the UK, is a free trade, comprehensive free trade agreement with the UK, not with GB, but with the UK, with regulatory cooperations, with customs facilitations, and with Irish border facilitations. That is an opening bid on which we can build an agreement. We will want more regulatory cooperations, we will want more facilitations. They will be here, we will be here, and we will negotiate. But of course, with this agreement, and with an Irish backstop that essentially says that if we don't have an agreement, the whole of the UK will be in a customs union with the EU, which we cannot escape from unilaterally. We need the EU's approval to do that, with full regulatory alignment with EU regulation. Never mind Northern Ireland being in the single market and the customs union. If that's the fallback option for the EU, they will have no incentive to meet us halfway. So we will lose the ability to do that. So I think this cannot stand. But as you see, it's going to be a very chaotic and turbulent period in the UK, in UK politics over the next few weeks. But I would not look at that and say that means that this is chaos and this is all bad and unstable. I would say that this legalistic process, which has failed, it's failed to deliver a deal that's good for the EU. I mean, never mind the UK. This is a very bad deal for the US, because it means that your potential ally in the global regulatory battleground for pro-competitive and not prescriptive, pro-innovation regulation, your ally has been basically taken off the field. So if we get through that process, we can have a reset, we can go back to the initial EU offer and build a trade agreement from there, which is a comprehensive trade agreement. We can negotiate with the US. The Japanese and others have already said that they want the UK to accede to the CPTPP. They want a letter from us by the middle of January on that point. And we can actually negotiate our proper WTO transition and then be an active member in the WTO on services liberalisation, on the built-in agenda in services, on all the things that have been stalled in the WTO, where the world's second biggest exporter of services ought to play some significant role.
Could you say something?
Yeah, please.
This deal is quite extraordinarily bad and must be stopped. And the most obvious manifestation we've seen in the last 2 days, speaking to some of your senior trade officials, is that there's no chance of doing a trade deal with a country that does not control its tariffs and its regulatory regime. And so that's reason enough for not allowing this deal to proceed. What is completely mad about it is that the government has completely tied itself up in knots in order to benefit a really quite smaller part of our economy. Only 8% of UK companies sell to the European Union. Sales represent 12% of GDP. They were 60% of our trade, they're down to 45%, they're heading to 35%. The European Commission itself says that 95% of world growth is going to be outside the European Union the next 20 years. So our sales to Europe have been going to increase, 0.02% since 1998, 16 times faster, 3.3% to the rest of the world. We have a surplus, the rest of the world, 41 billion. We have a huge deficit with the European Union of about 81, right, heading to 100. So it is completely ludicrous that we've tied ourselves into this customs union regime where we will be in a worse position than we are now. It's really important to understand that. I was the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I was the representative doing the Common Agricultural Policy negotiations. And we stopped some of the stupider things happening. It ended up as a bad reform, but working with allies, sometimes it's Germany, sometimes Hungary or Italy, whatever, we did stop some of the really idiotic things happening. And that's happened in a whole areas of government policy. The British have been the pebble in the shoe, pushing to be pro-technology, to be pro-commerce, to be pro-free trade, against the extraordinary hostility of the European Union to novel technologies. That's going to go. We won't be there. There'll be 27 countries making up law, not restrained by us. So our allies, possibly Ireland, possibly the Danes, possibly the Dutch, are going to be massively outnumbered, outvoted on qualified majority voting. And this really bad law now will come straight to us. We won't be able to amend it, we won't be able to repeal it, and if we don't obey it, we'll get clobbered by the European Court of Justice. It is a far, far worse position than we are currently in as members of the European Union. And then, just to make you really depressed, the real horror of this for me, because I was also Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is hiving Northern Ireland off effectively into a separate jurisdiction, which is a grotesque breach of the Belfast Agreement, the fundamental part of which, the absolutely key basis on which David Trimble very bravely wrote the agreement and got the Unionists to follow, was the principle of consent. The status of Northern Ireland was never going to change without the consent of the majority of the people of Northern Ireland. And the Assembly. Both of those are broken by this agreement. For what? For sales from Northern Ireland represent 4.9% of Northern Ireland sales. Those sales represent 0.2% of UK GDP. Going the other way, it's 1.6% of the Republic of Ireland's exports. And these sales are regular shipments, often of agricultural products, food products, are actually very well suited to being monitored because they're so highly regulated. I mean, every bullock has an ear tag, every sheep has 2 ear tags. And you've got regular shipments of milk from the same cows on the same farm, on the same tanker, on the same road, to the same destination every day, all tailor-made for modern processes and techniques used all around the world to handle borders. So this issue of the border is a non-issue. There is a border now. There is a tax border, there's a VAT border, there's a currency border, there's an excise duty border, and very important, a security border, all managed by technology. And that can go on. Nothing new, nothing exciting. I wrote a paper from the European Research Group, which I described as boring, because all we're talking about are existing techniques and existing processes, which I saw working in Rotterdam for 2 days last week. So what is extraordinary about this agreement, we've turned the whole thing upside down on a tiny, tiny point of a pyramid and got it completely wrong. And not be able to do a free trade deal with the United States is the most grotesque manifestation of that. And that's why I'll be very firmly voting against it if we get so far as the House of Commons.
Wish you all would be candid about your views about the Prime Minister's plan. So, coming from the other direction,
The British ambassador isn't here, is he?
we did host or Rita hosted the EU ambassador yesterday. So we've had all sides, I think, of the Brexit views this week. Coming from the other direction, if there is no deal, and I understand you said that's not your optimal situation, but if there is no deal, without it being fear-mongering, there are some practical challenges. The UK does not currently have its own regulatory capability in autos, aviation, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, rail, maritime, and if the EU and UK are at loggerheads, without having those capabilities, how do you make it so that your producers are not cut off from global supply chains? That strikes me as a very practical, realistic challenge.
Well, the first thing to say is that no deal actually covers a host of different possible outcomes, from a really stark no deal that happens on the 29th of March next year, with both sides being hostile because we're not giving them their 39 billion that they want and so on. From that, through a bare bones no deal, which deals with things like aviation arrangements, data arrangements and so on, but doesn't do anything more than that, through to a circumstance where the implementation period stays in place for 21 months. So we've actually got all the things you talk about for the 21 months, and we've got time to put them in place. So that's the first thing, there's a range of possibilities. But let me deal with the starkest. It's quite likely if we have the starkest of no deals, there will be a disruptive or turbulent summer, shall we say. In terms of regulatory arrangements, well, there's a whole series of statutory instruments being written, bits of secondary legislation being written to create many of these mechanisms you're talking about. It's very often not that difficult. I mean, some of the best regulators in Europe, ironically, are British, whether it's aviation or nuclear matters or whatever. We've passed quite a lot of legislation already towards that end. The things that people mostly talk about as the sort of fearful things of no deal, we've had all sorts of scare stories. For example, that there will be a choke at the border, so that there will be miles-long queues of lorries and so on. This may happen once or twice. It's happened before. In 2015, there was a 5-week lorry driver strike, French lorry driver strike, not that unusual actually. Britain didn't clog up. We didn't run out of food. We didn't run out of medicine. We didn't run out of the things that people fretted about. We just managed our way through it. But in the event of something like that happening, and the Dover-Calais link, which is the best known link with the European Union, if it clogs up in both directions. And that means that the French cannot export to us, as well as us not being able to export to them. We have levers we can use. 80% of the vehicles carrying trade across those links are actually continental vehicles, so they come over full and go back empty. If it needs to be, we can just stop empty ones going until it's convenient to us. And so a whole series of mechanisms of that sort of nature. The other thing to bear in mind is, and there's at least 300 odd planning projects around all of these issues. If we think no deal is likely, what we're going to need to do in the next few weeks is up the speed on them, but the vast majority will be fine. The other side of no deal, however, from the point of view of our near neighbours, is alarming. The worst case is the Irish agricultural industry. They sell something like 70% of their beef to us, and they would suddenly face a tariff for 40%. That wouldn't be very good for them. In the case of Holland and Belgium, they'll probably take a hit of about 3% to 4% on the GDP because of cross-channel traffic being inhibited and so on. We, on the other hand, have got we've got the upsides we've talked about that deals with the rest of the world, and of course our pound will adjust. We have a floating currency which will adjust and absorb many of these issues. As Shanker mentioned earlier, when the British people voted, or in advance of them voting to leave, almost every establishment economist in the UK said it will cause a recession, said it will cause a downturn, said it will cause a reduction in investment and so on. A reduction in employment. None of the above has happened. Our industrial output's gone up, our industrial exports have gone up, our employment are at record levels, all-time record levels. Unemployment is now lower than it's been in my entire adult life. I'm very old, so that's a long time. Generally speaking, as Shanker said, foreign direct investment into the country has been higher in every year since the referendum than it was in any year before the referendum. So a lot of these stories are nonsensical. There are issues. The first summer will be difficult and turbulent, but manageable. No insuperable problems. And the upside of it all is we have complete and total freedom to change our regulations as we see fit and strike any deal we see fit. So that's why people forget the upside. That's why I say it's not something to fear.
Right, I will be. Obviously, much the best would be a wide-ranging free trade deal. Everyone's quite clear about that, as offered by Tusk back in March. And one of the best things that might come out of this is we can collapse this awful, awful proposal of the last couple of days. We can move back to that pretty rapidly. Now we've got a solution to our borders. The whole no deal thing, I think, has got into I think we're at sort of 7th or 8th iteration now, Project Fear. Who is going to be so stupid as to stop stuff? Why are we going to stop stuff coming into our country? It's coming from suppliers who we trusted for years. Most of this has already been pre-cleared. Why are we going to suddenly worry about auto parts having a different standard, or dairy products coming from France, or pharmaceuticals coming from Italy or wherever? So the first thing is, I don't see anybody stopping this. I don't also really see that our neighbours are going to want to stop things either. The president of the region of France, which governs Calais, has been absolutely emphatic. He does not want any commercial war with the UK. So there's a very simple stuff, and Shanker's been good on this, and Paterson as well. The WTO rules make it very clear. You can't just suddenly leap onto phytosanitary regulations and use them as an excuse for stopping things. And the WTO rules and Trade Facilitation Agreement is absolutely clear about this. So anything stupid and arbitrary would be a clear breach of existing regulations to which the European Union has signed up to. So personally, I'm absolutely clear we'd much prefer to rattle on and do a free trade deal, but I'd also be relaxed about no deal. For a start, we would keep 39 billion, which mysteriously crept up to 46.8 billion in the budget for various different reasons. That is real money. £1 billion buys you 20,000 nurses, 20,000 teachers, about 29,000 soldiers every year. And we're talking 39 billion. We're also heading, if we get into the next financial round, which this ghastly proposal of the last 2 days says, we could be into another 10 or 20 billion. A year. That is real money, and that really has an impact on our constituents who are furious about this in the first place. So that is a pretty massive bonus for us, and it gives us quite a lot of money as a cushion if there's a bit of a bumpy ride.
Yeah, I think, I mean, clearly there would be disruptions on the UK and on the European side of no deal. But it's important to point out the disruption on the European side as well. For example, if we were to be in a situation of no free trade agreement, no, in other words, we're all at the common external tariff, then you'd be looking at significant problems for Bavaria in terms of autos and dairy, Catalonia for autos, Northern Italy for textiles and dairy, Ireland clearly for beef, and other rural aspects of the rural economy. And you know, if there's no deal and we have some big problem in financial services that causes a fragmentation of the capital pool in the City of London, that will increase the cost of capital to European businesses significantly. So there are lots of reasons why the forces on both sides will, I believe, ensure that we don't get to a point where there is no deal. But a lot of the preparations, just let's imagine that we are in this terrible situation. A lot of the economic forecasts based on this assume that the UK will do absolutely nothing, that we'll just be content to have the common external tariff, and we will continue, we will erect barriers to trade between the EU and the UK. And the reality is that actually there's a lot of things we would do. So for example, with pharmaceutical products and this famous issue of no medicine on shelves, well, clearly we would do unilateral batch testing and release. In fact, the government's own no deal briefings say that that's exactly what we would do. We would allow medicines produced in Europe into the UK. We can do that on a regulatory basis. The other thing we would do, and this we would have to do on an MFN basis,